Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Continental from the world of John Wick, starring Mel Gibson, Colin Woodell, Michelle Prada, Herbert Point Dujar, Nyong Kate Jessica Alain, Ao Edagun, Jeremy Bobb, Adam Shapiro, and Katie McGrath, directed by Albert Hughes and Charlotte Brandstrom. Now, why am I doing a mini series of John Wick? Because this takes place in the world, and it's on Peacock if anybody wants to know where it's at. If it's streaming anywhere, that kind of a thing. So let's just get straight into this review, because this is going to be a long one. In New York in the year 1955, as a boy, Winston Scott got in a lot of trouble with the cops along with his older brother as he tears up the first time. And then we move on to the 1970s, and Frankie, who's the brother, goes to a place where he's not supposed to be, and he is encountered by a threatening security guard named Lawrence and goes back to a party with Cormac O'Connor, played by Mel Gibson. And after meeting his friends, walks out of a hotel for assassins called the Continental, and as Frankie meets someone in the subway station and robs his boss' underground vault, as it's New Year's Eve and Frankie gets his partner killed and goes on a gun fu situation, and the violence in this is pretty fucking graphic, but hell, this is a prequel to John Wick. And these movies are violent in general. Frankie gets out alive with the woman, and this opening action sequence is, like I said, graphic, but at the same time, it's cool. In London, Winston Scott, played by Colin Woodell, is at a business meeting as Sylvester David's wife comes in as she talks about what makes her husband excited, and he gets Tony to talk to his wife Rose Davenport, and she disrespects David after hanging up on Tony. And do I like the characters? They're honestly fine. As we move on to Rose coming to Winston's hotel room and has sexual intercourse with him, and when they're done, Winston is captured and taken back to New York, and the dialogue is pretty corny, as is the writing, and this is rather interesting in a good way. Cormac is pissed off at his bodyguards, while Sharon, played by Ao Edagun, is present and says they're excommunicado, which is Latin for "you're fucked," according to Cormac. And this may be one of the better performances by Mel Gibson as of recently, as I've seen a few of them nowadays, as Winston arrives at the Continental and taken by Cormac and to ask where Frankie is at, but he doesn't know where he's at, and Cormac asks Winston if he could find Frankie and as well as establish him, and Winston doesn't care where Frankie is at, as he doesn't give a shit about it, and Sharon walks him out of the elevator, and someone humps KD, played by Michelle Prada, in the ass, and she complains about a guy leaving a dog shit on the sidewalk, like a douchebag people can be when they pull off that kind of bullshit. And she leaves another note on the motherfucker's car, and do I care for what's happening on KD's story? Not really, as all I care about are the scenes in the Continental and the scenes with Winston, Sharon, and Cormac. KD spies on some assassins by taking pictures of them and following them to the Continental, while the audience just learns she's a cop. KD almost goes inside the hotel until a couple named Mayhew, played by Jeremy Bobb, get her out of there. And I do like the shots of New York at daytime and nighttime, for that matter, as Winston looks for Frankie and gets into a place where he lives, which does involve kickboxing, and the cinematography is pretty good in all 3 episodes in this miniseries. Winston asks for a car to look for Frankie before Cormac does, and we move on to Lou, played by Jessica Alain, with her brother Miles, played by Hubert Point du Jour, arriving in a Volkswagen, and Miles talks about a job they must do which will get them killed, which is what Lou is concerned about, while Winston goes into a store in which Lou owns, and Miles asks Lou where Frankie is at, Winston asks where Frankie is at, and she gets all aggressive with Winston by saying she hasn't seen that piece of shit for months, and Miles and Lemmy, played by Adam Shapiro, point a gun at Winston, and they ask if Frankie is really Winston's brother, and Winston gives them proof and prepares some guns as they tell Winston where Frankie is at, probably at, and the actor playing Winston, named Colin Woodall, has been in things I haven't seen except for last year's Fly Me to the Moon, and he's actually pretty good as a younger Ian McShane. We get someone getting beat up by the adjudicator, this time played by Katie McGrath, in a mask, as this person they're beating up says Frankie took something of theirs. And the MacGuffin of this episode is Frankie, and we move on to Winston looking for Frankie as he makes a U-turn in the middle of traffic on the other direction as KD goes inside the Continental and gets to the bar, and she pulls all dollar bills instead of the golden coin that the assassins typically use in the building. And if you've seen the previous John Wick movies, you'll know what I mean. And she's denied a room to stay in, and people look at her suspiciously, which is preposterous of her to go in the building in the first place. And this is so pretty interesting as a mini-series. Winston enters a movie theater where Woody Woodpecker is playing, and Winston almost gets trapped by Frankie's wife, Yen, played by young Kate. And Frankie comes in and lets Winston go and wonders what the fuck happened to him until Cormac and his goons find them, while Winston learns Frankie stole Cormac's treasure as Yen fights them off to protect Frankie and Winston as they get out of there with Yen, and they go to a friend named Charlie's place and hide, and the dialogue works as a John Wick show. And Cormac brings in the twins named Hansel and Gretel, while Hansel looked like Lord Farquaad from the movie Shrek, as he looked comedic that way, and Gretel is flexible like hell, as we'll see at the end fight on the last episode. Winston and Frankie talk about memories, and Frankie brings up how he had a plan to betray Cormac and argue about their lives as Charlie's friend makes a phone call and makes a plan to get Frankie and Yen out of New York. And they go in a chase sequence, which was kind of hard to follow as people are frightened and more gunfire go off. And Winston, Frankie, and Yen escape to go in a building and gets encountered by a couple of guys, and Frankie beats their asses. And Winston and Yen finds a body in an apartment with one of the bad guys forced a fight with Yen while the baby is in there, as she beats his ass by killing the motherfucker, and Hansel and Gretel come in the elevator and shoot the pilot as well as the passengers of a helicopter, who are the bad guys. I don't get what's going on with that. As Frankie gets up and Winston is recovering and find one more guy to kill, and Winston does, and they get in the chopper, and Frankie gets shot by Hansel and Gretel until Frankie gets killed by Hansel and Gretel. And now Yen wants vengeance as she and Winston come to Miles and Lou's store and tell them the Keanu Reeves line set in the third John Wick film, as well as The Matrix, where he says he needs guns. Lots of guns. And this episode ended on a depressing note, as Winston got his brother back and now he's dead, which feels depressing to me. The next episode begins in the Bronx in the year 1955 with Winston and Frankie burning down in an apartment while killing people for Cormac, as Winston feels guilty about it. And we come back to the 1970s with Winston feeling sad and upset over Frankie's death, and Winston and Miles cremate his body, and we move on to Sagan in 1973, and someone gets tortured, as I'm led to believe it's a younger Yen, and this as an origin story of her story is boring as fuck, while Yen finds Frankie and falls in love with him. And we learn it's a dream, which is something I criticize for this show for, as Lou almost gets robbed and beats the shit out of a goon and a businessman reasons with her, while Katie gets visited by Mayhew and get to an argument. And the acting by the actors are good, but not great in my opinion. Katie learns Frankie has got killed, as Winston and with others have a funeral for Frankie and Winston, wanting vengeance against Cormac, and they plan on taking over the Continental. until Yen wakes up and sees the truth behind the death of Frankie and blames Winston for coming back into his life by getting him killed, and they fight until she walks away. And what a sentimental scene as Katie tries to see the body of Frankie as it went missing, and she tortures the doctor, which is not the best idea, while Cormac eats and meets the adjudicator, while Sharon is in the room, and the audience doesn't see her face until the end of episode 3. And I like how Cormac doesn't like the adjudicator, while the adjudicator doesn't like him, as that was pretty good acting by Mel Gibson and Katie McGrath. Winston shoots guns with Miles and Lemmy, and they recruit someone named Jenkins, who was Miles and Lou's father's friend, and we get introduced to him aiming a gun at families, but his main focus is a man and hits a tree at first, but he'll eventually get him shot dead, and Miles visits Jenkins to ask him for help to fight the Continental with them, and he wants in as long as he wears a prescription glasses, which was amusing. And Winston tries to meet Maisie, who's the Bowery Queen, and he finds someone, and she says they don't serve his kind, and she comes in, and I'm just getting bored from this episode, as it's all about getting prepared for war. But I do appreciate how this will eventually tie up in the John Wick universe. Yin finds clues on who Frankie's brother is, and she wants vengeance against the people who got Frankie killed, and she ends up killing 3 goons that broke into their home, which was completely violent, while Winston talks with Maisie about her army wanting them to join their crew, and she says no, while she has goons attacking the assassins in the cars, and she sends Winston out a different way and sends him on his way, as Cormac prays because he's a Christian, just like Mel Gibson is in general, after he sends some assassins out of the way, as Winston almost fights someone who worked with Frankie and worked for Charlie, and they hire Charlie's men, and some of the locations did remind me of the previous John Wick movies in the most appreciative way. Lemmy explains to Lou, while he wants to join the suicide mission, and he says because he loves Miles, and the crew gets together to plan the hit on the Continental to kill Cormac, and Mayhew is asked by Katie to look for someone without a warrant, and he accepts as Miles drives Yen to a location where he talks with her and makes her join the suicide mission. And the dialogue is corny until Miles goes inside in a different car, and Yen stays in the car, and they get the fuck out of there. And like Yen said, it's a shit plan, which makes sense because it is. Sharon chats with someone about how someone is going to leave because there's a whole new world out there, as Sharon explains how to get to America, and Sharon decides to stay because of Cormac. He's saying he'll get his father into the country, which, yeah, bullshit. While Winston spies on them and with Jenkins, and I like the backstory of Sharon, as we didn't know that in the John Wick universe. As Sharon comes in a bar to look at a letter, and a bartender shows him something, while Lou steals the letter and gives it to Winston, as she goes after a kid throwing a rock at a building, and she catches him and beats up the businessman's henchman. Lou does, while James Brown's Get On Up off that thing plays in the background, and I thought, what the fuck am I watching at this point? And is this supposed to be comedic when I think of that song? I think comedy. And this certainly ain't a comedy for motherfucking sure. The businessman talks with Lou because he wants to steal their building away from Miles and Lou, as their father owns that building, and Jenkins gets back to the building and chats with Lou, and she gets on the bus and tells the driver the bus is out of service to talk with Sharon in a private area with Winston, and he asks what Cormac has said about his brother, and he says Frankie is a terrible thief, and tells Sharon to think about how evil he is, and asks him to not listen to Cormac's lies and lets Sharon go, while Cormac hires a new guy who comes from school and vouches for his education, so he plays some music on the violin because because so, and Cormac believes Sharon might not be appreciating what he does for Cormac as he kills the new hire with the violin, and as the adjudicator believes Cormac is corrupt, and Sharon comes back to the Continental knowing Cormac, who only cares about himself, and sees the new hire dead and on the ground as Cormac tells Sharon some bullshit lies about how he was stealing things from Cormac, and Sharon warns Cormac about Winston wanting him dead, and he says how he'll steal him in loyalty, as this episode ends with loyalty, and I can respect that. This third and final episode begins in New York City in the year 1955, where Winston and Frankie's parents are abandoned by their mother as she leaves them in the trunk, and she gets killed, which was fucking heartbreaking right off the bat. And Miles and Yen kill some people with Lemmy and Jenkins while practicing how to kill Cormac and every single motherfucker in the Continental. And Miles and Winston argue about Maisie showing up and killing Sharon, which Winston doesn't want to do. And their dialogue is smart and better acted by the actors. And Lou and Lemmy sees KD's coming into the shop to look for Winston, and Lou doesn't give her shit. And someone writes pig on her car because she's a cop, while Jenkins gets in an apartment to take a shot at the Continental at a woman named Alana's place, while they don't know Winston's plan of attack. And I feel like they don't have confidence in Winston, and that felt convincing. Hansel and Gretel get the bus driver with Sharon, asking him where did they bring Winston to, and how he arranged a meeting with him, while he was distracted by Hansel looking a hell of a lot like Lord Farquaad from Shrek. And Winston talks with Maisie about joining their suicide mission, and as Hansel and Gretel get to the shop, and follows Lou as she makes a call to warn Winston, until Mayhew comes to Lou, and she beats his ass without realizing he was a cop. And Winston gets the message, and Cormac decides to attack Winston and prays to God, to make him get Winston, while Winston gets a visitor from Lou saying the cops are looking for him. And Mel Gibson does do a little overacting, which did feel odd to me. Hansel and Gretel look for Winston at the hotel, and he's staying as they attack him, while Lou is in the room with him, while Mayhew gets to KD in her car and is only getting kicked out of her car, and she goes to the hotel to find Winston and eventually get into a gun battle as Hansel knocks Winston out and kills the hotel clerk and takes Winston to the Continental. And Lou goes after Hansel and Gretel as Mayhew finds KD, and she gets an idea to go to the Continental, and he lets her go, and she gets there and gets to a room for the night. And Winston has a conversation with Cormac as he monologues about how he loves the Continental as a hotel, and he had it for 20 years. And almost has Winston overthrown, but Jenkins fires at Cormac's henchman, and Sharon gets a shotgun and it points it at Cormac, and he runs out knowing he was betrayed by Cormac, and that was a reveal long coming. And I like the way they portrayed this betrayal. The clerk at the Continental finds Yen and Miles, among others, coming to the Continental and have a shootout without Lou. And the businessman's son comes in and says to her, he's coming for you now. And she takes the son outside to the businessman, and she talks to him about how her father built the buildings she's running. And the son wants her to not let him take his own son, while Cormac breaks into a room where there's a camera in there, and all of the assassins get a red light to go after Winston, and some other assassins, even Hansel and Gretel, and Cormac tells everybody to look for Winston. And Katie beats up a couple of assassins and says she was a cop but not anymore, and have an endless gunfight for most of the episode. And I like how this final action sequence starts. Lemmy gets into a fight with a woman, and she gets killed, as does Lemmy. And he's the first one down while Miles gets into the fights, and Jenkins shoots at them as he's the sniper. And Winston and Sharon get encountered by assassins, and Cormac, as he comes in, and Sharon knows he murdered the new hire and that was going to quit, and the Continental, and Cormac turns off the lights, and lets the assassins kill each other as Lou and the son blows up on the businessman, as well as the building, and Winston kills every single assassin in the room, while Cormac beats up on the elevator man while he says he has to be announced, and Jenkins bumps into the woman, whom I forgot her name, and Katie points a gun at Winston and tells Sharon to get the fuck out of there, as Cormac makes an announcement to kill Winston, as Katie has him hostage, because she wants to kill him for burning her family, which was shown in the beginning of the second episode, and almost gets burned, and she says how sorry he's sorry to her, and that was melodramatic. Jenkins shoots at Katie and Winston, getting their healthy but healing her, and gets out and almost gets killed by Sharon, saving his life, as Cormac announces Winston's death for $2 million, and Sharon learns Winston is Frankie's brother and knew him very well, and everybody looks for Winston as the assassins kill other assassins, while Yen looks for Gretel because she killed Frankie at the end of episode 1, and Hansel and Gretel come out of the room as Jenkins chats with the woman while he kills people in the Continental, left to right, and Yen finds Hansel and Gretel and takes their guns as Miles comes in and lets them go free, as he tells her not to kill them, as they killed Frankie, and they have more of the shootout, and this sequence isn't as violent as the last two John Wick movies. Lemmy sends a grenade to Hansel and Gretel, while Lou sends her son to a room with one of the people and the heist, as Hansel picks up a grenade and sends it to Lemmy, while Miles sees and is knocked down, until he gets back up and shoots Hansel but runs out of bullets, and they fight, and Lou comes in and fights Hansel with Miles, and they do gain up on him, but he beats their asses up until eventually Miles gets stabbed, and Lou suffocates as the son comes in with a gun, and Lou shoots Hansel dead, which was a fantastic fight, and Winston sees Lemmy dying in his hands, which was dramatic for sure, but I liked the fight between Hansel versus Miles and Lou, as that was a fantastic fight scene. Excuse me. Winston and Sharon get each other's backs, while Cormac is worried for his life and kills the man in the room, as we move on to Yen versus Gretel without guns and knives and just fist to fist. And I do like that fight, as well as Gretel beats Yen's ass first, but eventually Yen improves her fight until Yen kills Gretel, with Yen getting stabbed in the hand, and she grabs Gretel in the stomach and beats and kills her ass in the water, and her body slashes everywhere, and it works, but at the same time it's brutal for damn sure, as Cormac kills a man in the room, and the adjudicator calls Cormac, and he plays some kind of video game and sets up a self-destruct button while he traps everyone in the Continental, and Cormac plays his vicious character anyways, in the show, about absolutely vicious, but Mel Gibson plays it well, as Katie sees Cormac trying to escape, and chaotic things are happening, which works for the show. Winston gets to Cormac and fight to the death for Frankie, while Katie comes in and shoots Cormac in the heart and in the head, and somehow forgives Winston, as that murder of her family was done by Cormac, and she walks away, and Winston gets on a train, and the self-destruction is stopped by Winston himself forcing the dead man's hand and win the Continental back, as Winston talks with the adjudicator until he shoots her in the head, while Winston takes over the Continental with Sharon as his assistant. But first he was but he says it's his home until we get to the first of the John Wick movies, and the show is good but not great in my opinion. But will Ballerina be better than this? I'll say next time. But as for this show, how good was it? Let's talk about it in a rating. I'll give this show a 6.5 out of 10. The violence is pretty fucking graphic for damn sure, but hell, it's a prequel to John Wick, and typically that universe is violent like this show. And I do like the characters, and honestly, they're fine at best, and this is maybe one of Mel Gibson's better performances as of recently, as I've seen very few of them anymore. And the writing is interesting in a good way, and as I only care for the scenes as at the Continental, and as well as any scene from Winston and Sharon and Cormac. I do like the shots in New York on both day and night, and the cinematography is pretty good in all 3 episodes of this miniseries, and it's an interesting, but probably not my favorite in the world of John Wick, in my opinion. While there were times it got a little preposterous, but at the end of the day, it's a good show, not a great show. The dialogue works for a John Wick show, even though it's corny, sure. And there were some fight sequences that worked for me, as this is a recommendation for the show, and as it's not as good as the movies, in my opinion, but it still works, as I'm worried for Ballerina because it's the director of Underworld, and he doesn't make great action movies in general, particularly Live Free or Die Hard, which I'll get to in December. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this review, and I will be back with Ballerina next time. And until then, guns. Lots of guns.